Hi, Mark J T Griffin. Welcome to 10 by 6.
Hi there, Jason. How you doing? Great
Well,
to see you.
yeah, well, absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much. Yeah, we've introduced you to 10 by 6 today and bring you on the program to talk about your film, which is Lawrence After Arabia, which you wrote, produced, and directed. And it's been out there for a little bit of time now. So what we want to do is just tell us about what the film is about and how's it doing.
Well, it's doing great. The film follows the last few months of Lawrence's life. Um, we look at some of his relationships, the sort of things that he's starting to get into. He's rebuilding relationships with people that he knew before he left the Royal Air Force. He's just retired. He's trying to find his feet, trying to figure out what he's doing in the future. And he starts to get involved with a number of things that that might get him into trouble. Of course, he is then involved in an accident, and he dies shortly afterwards. And then the film looks at the possible reasons as to why he could have been, why it could have been an assassination. So we look at the aftermath and how the British Secret Service were trying to control the situation after the crash, it follows it right the way through to a conclusion.
Right. Okay. Fascinating. So, in terms of the conclusion, is it a conclusion that you, as the writer, tended to sympathise with in relation to the evidence that was available? Or were there other parameters that led you to that place?
Well, it's a conclusion that I kind of came to probably finally about 10 years ago. I'm kind of convinced that this was potentially the first state assassination by the British Secret Service. And it happened in 1935 when people wouldn't have expected anything like that. The trust in the government was total and complete. But of course, now we know that governments lie. And, our government at the moment is lying on on pretty much an hourly basis. So it looks at the film. The film has grown in its support over the years in making, and I've built into it the evidence that I think is as why he could have possibly been assassinated.
Let's focus on this because it's obviously really, really interesting. In terms of his friendships before he died and relatively long term, one of them was Sir Winston Churchill. Do you think there's any way that he was aware of what was going on in terms of any plot, or do you think he would have been kept out of it?
No. Churchill for me is a little bit of an enigma. He's treated, he's revered, the savior of the nation, that sort of stuff. But Churchill had a bit of a very dark background. He was he can be seen as a racist. He could be seen as highly nationalistic. There were some dark sides to his character. Now, I think he knew some of the things that Lawrence was up to. One of the elements was Churchill wanted to create an overarching directorship for the Secret Service, so that you had the MI5, MI6, as it would have been, with special branch, with the police, with the military, all sharing information, because he knew a war was coming, and he knew that the way that he was going to have to win it, or it would need to be won, is through intelligence service and intelligence sharing. And he felt that Lawrence had the talents to be able to move that along very, very quickly. So I think he knew about that part. He was also Lawrence was also involved or trying to figure out what Mosley and the Black Shirts were up to. Now, I'm not sure whether at the time, he was infiltrating or trying to join. I think it's more likely he was infiltrating with the possibility of potentially meeting Hitler to hopefully stop a Second World War. I think Lawrence came back from the First World War a very broken man. He'd been betrayed by his government. He was suffering from PTSD. He'd lost two brothers, his best friend. He wasn't in a great place, and I think he'd have done anything to stop a Second World War, including such an embarrassing thing as meeting Hitler, which of course the British establishment would not have wanted. He was also starting to rebuild relationships with the Arabs. Now, the Arabs, of course, were getting starting to find difficulties with a number of Jewish settlers. The Balfour Agreement had originally agreed to something like 5,000 a year, and during those 34, 35, even into 36, there were something like 35,000 settlers coming every year, and the country was becoming a Jewish enclave, of course, the way we have now, and the Palestinians, the Arabs, being pushed into a corner. All the problems that we have now in the Middle East are all the root cause of what happened and the agreements that were made in the peace conferences of 1919, where Lawrence and Churchill were trying to give the Arabs some form of self-government, which they never got.
No. And how do you think, hypothetically, he would have responded then to the formation of the Jewish state just over a decade later?
I think he originally thought that Jewish money would help the Arabs there, but I don't think, and I think when he knew about the Balfour Agreement, the volumes, I think he felt it was a good thing, and he's quoted as saying it was a good thing. But that was very, very shortly after it was in the early 20s, and I think things got worse and worse and worse. And I think he knew things were going wrong when King Faisal, his friend, was assassinated in 1934. Once that happened, he knew that, things are going to go bad. And of course, Lawrence was killed 1935. 1936, you have the Arab uprising, which was put down very violently by the British administration. I think Lawrence could see that it was going the wrong way.
So what we can conclude then, he was very much a thorn in the side of the British establishment, and there was probably logical reasons from the establishment side to try and do something about it.
Yeah, and he was starting to cross lines and do things that were not that the British establishment did not like. He'd annoyed the royal family by not accepting a knighthood. He'd basically walking out. He'd been invited to the Buckingham Palace just after he came back from Arabia. Was asked to kneel, kind of, what's going on here, and just stood up, turned around, and walked out. That was, there were no protocol to handle that. He was, with the Secret Service, if this directorship had happened, it would have meant that the Kell, who was leader of the Secret Service, would have been subservient to him. Now, you have to remember that Lawrence was an Irish bastard. He was someone who came from an illegitimate background, an Irish background, and again at that time not accepted. And that there would have been a huge stigma behind that. So the establishment would not have liked Lawrence, and even at the time of the negotiation of the peace, the Paris Peace Conference, the Cairo Peace Conference, at that time he was persona non grata. The British establishment felt he'd gone native and tried to get him out of the way. So he was an agitator. He was like a hand grenade, and would try and change things in a very in a very a violent way, if you like, to try and move things along. So yeah, he was a great character. Like him a lot.
I get that impression. I don't want to sort of ruin it for those people who haven't seen the film, but one of the things about his accident, obviously a few days prior to his death, was that he was supposedly trying to avoid two boys on bicycles. Is that right?
Yeah. Well, okay. Yes. I mean, what you've got to the piece of information that everybody seems to the folks drop is this black car. There was a car going in the opposite direction, so the boys and Lawrence were going one way, black car going the other way. What happened was, according to the witnesses, the black car passed the boys on the bicycles, and then something happened as the black car passed Lawrence. Lawrence then went out of control, smacked into the back of the boys on the bicycles, and of course knocked one off. Well, knocked both of them off his bike, injured the one, not seriously, but of course that his action to try and avoid the boys, he was probably traveling about 40 miles an hour, but without a helmet, and on those conditions, and on the road wasn't tarmacked, it was a very rough surface. He would have had no chance right. at all.
Especially back then, with the level of medical attention and medical care that was available compared to now.
Yeah, I think he was, he was so seriously injured that the chance of survival when they got into the hospital anyway was minimal. He had a serious fractured skull. The brain was exposed. He had very little chance of survival. Right. Even today's medical facilities, the speed it was going and without a helmet, he was doomed.
Right. Thank you. Well, we'll move away from his death and the end of his life. Some of the things are sort of, obviously doing my research over the last few weeks and sort of just trying to find those idiosyncrasies, those different things. He didn't find out his true identity until he was 30, and it's reported that his mother had an adulterous relationship with her boss, and it led to Lawrence's birth, and then her and her boss left her husband and moved to England. I'm guessing that coming from Ireland, going to England, and then finding out at 30, it's not like you've had your childhood to get used to this. You're finding out at 30 that whoever you thought was your father wasn't.
Sorry, Jason, because I there, but I mean the relationship. I mean, basically what happened was Thomas Chapman, his father, was the sort of he was Irish land gentry, and he was married and he had 4 daughters, and they got in a governess called Sarah Juna to look after the girls. And what happened was, as you said, Chapman had a relationship with Juna, and they started having children. Now Chapman decided that he wanted to divorce his wife, which again in the late 1890s would have been unheard of. So he left. He packed up and left with Sarah, and the first place they went was Brittany, and then they went to the Channel Islands, and they kind of moved around a bit, and they took the assumed name of Lawrence. So they eventually moved to Wales, where Lawrence was born, and then eventually they ended up in Oxford, where they kind of settled down a little bit more, where Lawrence went to high school and eventually to university, of course. So they were kind of always on the move. Now, I don't think, first of all, Sarah was a real tough cookie. She regularly beat the boys. I think she was the one that almost taught Lawrence how to how to go above and beyond, even in pain. And yes, he didn't find out until quite late that that he was illegitimate, and his family name wasn't actually Lawrence. And I think he actually found out this in his late teens, and that would have been a huge switch for him. I think he'd have said, right, I need to survive. And very shortly after, he went to Kargamish for archaeological work, which led directly to him kind of joining the army and making maps and becoming essentially a spy. So his background was very, as far as, again, the British establishment were concerned, would not have he would not have endeared himself to the establishment. But I think that was actually a huge motivator for Lawrence. He wanted to prove to himself. I mean, there's a nice connection between Lawrence and Churchill. Both Lawrence and Churchill believed that it was their parents, their family, that had almost been an albatross around their necks in progressing. In Churchill's case, his mother; in Lawrence's case, his illegitimacy. So there was a connection and an understanding there.
And given all of that, and especially the comparisons you make with Churchill, and both were relatively short men, weren't they? I mean, Thomas was only 5'5", so to be able to get the positions that they got, they didn't come. Obviously, they weren't a dominating physique in that sense.
No,
of height.
by any means. No. I mean, he was like a little pocket rocket. I think that was the way I always think of him. I mean, it's interesting. I'm always kind of interested by, people often watch Lawrence of Arabia and think that's what Lawrence was like. And I think Lawrence of Arabia, though a fantastic film, I love David Lean's work. Lawrence, played by a 6'1" Peter O'Toole with blonde hair and blue eyes, that's not kind of what he was like at all. No. There's a film with Ralph Fiennes called Dangerous Man, and I think that's a very close approximation to what Lawrence was like. When I cast Tom Barber-Duffy, Tom's about 5'10", so still a little bit tall, but I was looking for an intensity and a vulnerability, which is what Tom had to play the role that I'd written. I think the thing about Lawrence's character is that it's never been shown that he had, shell shock, PTSD, whatever you want to call it. And also that his background was, pretty horrible in the way he was beaten by his mother. So I wanted that as part of my story because it showed how he grew from that, I think.
Yes, definitely. He never had battlefield training. As you said earlier, he lost 2 brothers in World War One. He refused a knighthood, and he listed under an assumed name. So he had that, like you say, he had that tragedy in his background, but he also had that cunning.
Yes.
And I guess
the assumed name, it's an interesting point. He actually changed his name by deed poll to T.E. Shaw. So he died as T.E. Shaw rather than T. Lawrence. Now,
and that was because he was a friend of George Bernard Shaw, isn't that right?
Correct. Yeah, that's where he got the name. Now, the reason for that, if you look at what that actually represents, he's actually murdering himself. He's killing the person who was born of an illegitimate Irish family background and killing the person who was Lawrence of Arabia. He was desperate to escape that epithet and to try and be seen for his own worth. And I mean, if you look at the work that he did during the late 20s and early 30s until he left the Royal Air Force on motorboats, sadly something we couldn't cover because of time in the film. In that period, I mean, he did some fantastic work. Absolutely, you know, he'd seen an accident in Plymouth Harbour where a seaplane had crashed, 12 people on board, and essentially they all died, all drowned, because people couldn't get out. They couldn't get rescue boats out quick enough. And he kind of said, right, I'm not going to let this happen again, and focus his energy on doing that, which I think is very laudable. And you know, he created the boats that are forerunners of the RNLI boats now. So, you know, it's you know, he gave a lot. You know, his own accident got Hugh Cairns so affected by Lawrence's death that he pushed dispatch riders to wear crash helmets. So, you know, there were benefits of Lawrence's life. You know, his work, Seven Pillars, is you know, still used in Sandhurst and West Point, as you know, as the original blueprint for guerrilla warfare. Tough reading, but yeah.
Yes, yeah. Your first two examples, the helmet and the RNLI boats, seem to be a lot more positive than the Sandhurst and West Point training manuals for killing people.
Quite.
But yeah, no, I certainly understand that, and for him to have that influence, and if he was able to, I don't know, somehow be able to look back on what had happened since his death, I'm guessing he'd be fairly comfortable, fairly happy. Do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think he'd be. I think one of the things that he'd still be wringing his hands over, and we actually kind of have this little epilogue at the end of the film that talks about it, that is read by Brian Cox, about the fact that, you know, it's been more than 100 years since the 1919 peace conference, and we still have huge issues in Arabia, you know, in the Middle East, and it's all because of what happened. The British French carve up of Arabia, carving it up for future influence, rather than what Lawrence and even Churchill were trying to do, which is give Arabia some sort of self-rule. So, you know, I think the fingers should be firmly pointed at the British and the French in the way that we have problems out there now. It's very sad, and I'm sure Lawrence would be wringing his hands at that still.
And I guess many there would argue that conflict and division is how the establishment like it, because a cohesiveness brings unity, and a unity brings collaboration, and collaboration then becomes a threat to the establishment. So
right, yeah.
Keeping an area in perpetual conflict, and hopefully Lawrence would understand that there is something much more structural going on than just an accidental uprising every so often, so to speak.
Well, quite. I mean, it's and the strange thing is that even now, what was beginning at that time, I think, was the beginning of propaganda, the beginning of the government trying to control things in a different way, and that has gone. You know, it's gone from quite a small way as it was in the 30s to the way it is now, where, you know, everything we hear, we have to question. We have to, you know, the government. What Lawrence would think of, you know, the current government, I just dread to think he would be in. I think he would just be amazed. You know, there is no way he would have had any respect, as I guess most people do, of the current government. It would be terrible.
He's buried very close to where we are, just up the road near Wool in Morton.
Yeah,
in St Nicholas's Church. That was his final resting place. A number of dignitaries came to his funeral, and it's it's still it's a tourist attraction, and it's something that even local people will regularly go along and just have a quiet moment at his graveside. So even though we're nearly 90 years on from his death, he's still very much a resounding part of local, national, and international history. So
Yes.
just finally, do you think that the film that you made has done him justice?
Yes, I do. I think what the film has done is made people question the story of the time, and also, as you said, Lawrence is still, has this sort of hero status. He is a local character, and everybody is interested in the story, whether they agree with it or not. I always say that you could start a pub fight in Dorset if you started talking about Lawrence. It is a polarizing topic. But yeah, I think the story shows what a hero he was, and the witness, the way that the witness Catchpole was treated. I always think that the movie is actually about two heroes, because Catchpole stuck to his story under all the pressures he had of being attacked by the press. Catchpole was pretty stout arrow, and I think Lawrence would have been very proud of what he did.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Mark J T Griffin, for coming on the program today. Been absolutely fascinating. And even though I haven't yet had an opportunity to see the film, I really do hope to see it very, very soon. Yeah. Thank you so much.
We're going to do another tour. We've been asked to play a number of dates again at the end of January. So we're doing another Q&A tour where Fantastic. I screen the film and I introduce and then do a Q&A. So we're doing that last week in January. The dates will be out in a week or so. So keep your eyes peeled on LawrenceAfterArabia.com. Thanks, Jason.
Fabulous. Thank you.